See You Now is a podcast highlighting the innovative and human-centered solutions that nurses are coming up with to solve for today's most challenging healthcare problems. Created in collaboration with Johnson & Johnson and the American Nurses Association, and hosted by nurse economist and health tech specialist, Shauna Butler.
Hey, See You Now listeners, it's Shauna Butler. As we roll into October, we're honoring Indigenous Peoples Day and reflecting on how ancestral knowledge, wisdom, and practice has the power to transform mental health and well-being and strengthen a sense of connection to heritage, identity, and history. Building from the 1977 United Nations convenings, in October 2021, President Joe Biden signed the first presidential proclamation of Indigenous Peoples Day, a commemoration honoring the sovereignty, resilience, and immense contributions that Native Americans have made to the world. The proclamation also serves as recognition to how past and present cultures have endured, survived, resisted, and flourished. We're returning to an earlier episode that explores how Indigenous nurses embrace ancestral wisdom of using a strengths-based, community-based approach to building resilience, coping skills, and improving mental health and well-being. Let's dive in. A key facet to good mental health and well-being is resilience, that ability to cope and adapt in healthy ways to adversity and stress, to trauma and crisis. Resilience protects us from conditions such as depression and anxiety, and knowing that you're part of something larger, that you're connected to a greater purpose and a bigger story than just your own, lies at the root of resilience. Research indicates that whether or not the story is a happy one, just knowing the stories of pivotal life experiences helps marshal psychological strengths. And when children grow up knowing their family's history and ancestry, where their grandparents grew up, what their parents' childhoods were like, they have better coping skills and a stronger sense of purpose and direction and belonging.
And so I began to really focus on helping to return our youth to being interested in and encouraging them to look at who they were originally and who they were meant to be, and that we have the right to be who we were meant to be.
For Native and Indigenous peoples, the stories of origin, of strength, of history, of identity have been and continue to be central in building resilience and experiencing optimal health. On this episode of See You Now, we meet Indigenous nurse researcher John Lowe and discover how he is addressing long-standing structural impediments that have kept Native youth from connecting to their cultural heritage, Native identity, and to a history that, as John describes, is a source of great strength and resilience.
We are in a time when we need to have this next generation be able to understand and come to know that they are part of a bigger group across the world, and that unity, that interaction, that intersection of who we are as Indigenous people is going to be very, very important.
John established the first Center for Indigenous Nurse Research for Health Equity, where he is innovating on ancestral wisdom and tradition through practices like the Talking Circle to enable American Indian, Alaska Native, and Indigenous youth to move away from harmful behaviors and move toward lives and coping mechanisms that are strength-based and positive.
I am John Lowe, and I'm a professor of nursing at University of Texas at Austin School of Nursing, and I am developing a Native American and Indigenous nursing research for Health Equity Center. I am Cherokee Creek and Lenape. I'm a Cherokee tribal member. My work has focused on developing interventions and developing approaches to bring our people to health equity versus just doing away with health disparities. Our main focus is to do this through developing more Indigenous and Native nurse researchers.
I wanted to open this conversation in a way that really respects and reflects the Native American culture and traditions that you come with. So as we enter into this discussion in this meeting, what is the appropriate, traditional, respectful way for us to begin?
Thank you for that. In Cherokee language, it would be OCO, which is hello, and Tuhija, which is how are you? And a response would be Ostav, which is I'm good. Some other ways would be to acknowledge who our lineage is and what clan we're from. I'm from the Deer clan. And I am actually a combination of 3 different tribes. On my father's side, Cherokee and Creek, and my mother's side is Lenape, and her father was Irish. Another traditional way would be to acknowledge the land and pay respect to the land that we sit on. And so I like to often, because I'm in many different areas of the country, and right now I just sort of like to do this eclectic of what's now the United States, or even Mother Earth or Turtle Island, which we often refer to as all the indigenous people and who we come from. Usually when I'm being asked to talk about myself or our people, then I definitely go through and I would introduce and talk about my elders who have been guiding me through my journey, because without them, it just would not have happened that way. And so they have been so generous with contributing to who I am. Osio Tahija, Chalagi. My name is John, and in Cherokee it would be Johnny. My clan is Deer Clan. I come from my mother's side, who is Lenape, and that's an Eastern tribe. And my father's mother was Cherokee. My grandmother who raised us, our maternal figure, and my father's father was Creek. I am a descendant of those traditions and tribes, and those traditions but mostly identify as culturally as Cherokee or Chalagi. These traditions are very important to us, and I think this may help to direct some of the conversation about what happened with those traditions. So often what we find is in our youth that they don't know or haven't been encouraged to know those traditions in some areas, and that's not everywhere. And there are reasons for that. We had these generations of boarding school. We had these generations of where you weren't supposed to speak your language. It was evil, it was wrong, it wasn't passed on, to where to be able to have a future, you had to deny some of those things. And so you connect the dots, and without those traditions, who we were meant to be and who we were supposed to be got interrupted. And then we come to the place to where now we have the issues we have. This has really informed our work in the sense that we know that we have a sovereign right to have that tradition. We have a right to be able to impart that to our young now. And so that's why we do the work we do. So I'm at University of Texas at Austin, School of Nursing, at the Native American and Indigenous Nursing Research Center. And it is the first and only Indigenous and Native American Nursing Research Center worldwide. And I work around the world and developing that work to have an international focus. We refer to that as the Big Four. That's the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. We're the 4 nations in the world that have probably the largest Native and Indigenous populations. There are nurses who are Indigenous in each of the countries who are leading the effort in nursing research in the country. So I'm the one in the US, Odette Best, who's a professor in Australia, and she's Aboriginal, Denise Wilson in New Zealand, who is Maori, and then Lisa Bearskin is First Nations in Canada. And so it's a real honor to have the 4 of us work together to move this agenda forward.
let's talk about that agenda, because
Okay.
it's a center that's specifically focused on Indigenous populations, and it is research that is driven by those who are most familiar, because it's a lived experience as well as culturally active. But there's a research agenda that's quite specific.
When we think about what's the motivation, what's their underlying reason to have nurses and Native and Indigenous nurses lead this work, I think often about who knows the story and who can tell the story. When we think about research, I have done both research from a Western scientific perspective and both from an Indigenous scientific perspective, and both help to tell the story. Many are working with us, and I think that's an asset, and that's a great contribution. But without the context of the story, and often numbers, statistics, numbers, and rates of prevalence of epi type of data would not have quite the significance without the story. The story relates to who Native American and Indigenous people are. We have a history, and we have creation stories that define who we are. We were in areas, in parts of the world that we were inhabiting, and then that got interrupted. Others came, and in most incidences, they came to take and not to share. In that taking, then our experience changed, meaning our lived experience changed, away from being on lands where life had meaning and a connection to the land. So in that experience of losing the land to others and then being exploited because of the land and the richness of the land and the natural resources that it offers, our genocide experience began. And so the story is that there are a group of people who were here, who had knowledge, who had a way of life, who had a culture of health and wellness, and that all changed. But the story today is that we are living the consequences of that, and we are still living in the truth of that experience, plus living with the truth that we still have that knowledge. We still have Indigenous knowledge. We still have our wisdom. We have our wisdom keepers. And that the future for us as a people is steeped into that wisdom and in that knowledge. Along with, there are, as we say in research, we're always looking for new knowledge or discovering knowledge that has been there. And so our future is steeped in coming to know new things, new knowledge, and especially about optimal health, which is health equity for our people. And we believe that nurses play a major role in that. And that unless we prepare nurses who are Native and Indigenous to be able to walk that journey and to be able to have the acceptance into places where that is being done. And then also there's acceptance of the cultural knowledge along with the Western knowledge. And so many places don't want that. And so who can gather the story and who can have the respect of our communities that the story will not be exploited or abused? And so we know that that's usually the nurse, and not that any other profession, discipline, science, or otherwise is not important, but nursing has that ability and has that history of being respectful. That's part of our motivation for doing what we do. The other is that we are the most underrepresented in the world as far as who has the advanced preparation to be able to do the research, both from a Western science perspective and from an Indigenous science perspective. So that's one of our agendas, is to increase the ability of the journey of Native and Indigenous nurses to be able to do this kind of work.
And your research center has really taken a specific interest in health disparities. Talk to me about your research and the disparities that you are addressing.
That's a good question. And it's one that makes me reflect on an experience I had several years ago. I was asked to give a presentation to a university that I was not affiliated with, but it was Native American Heritage Month. And I was asked to provide a presentation to the Health Science Division at the university. So I agreed, and there were physicians, there was medical students, dental students, nursing students, et cetera, et cetera. And as usual, what I did was I went into providing and sharing all the information about our history, our genocide experience, what happened along the journey throughout the years, given an explanation of now why we have the issues we have because of all of the trauma, both from a biological and emotional, mental perspective, fight or flight responses that we have inherited in response to what gets triggered, genetic memory, the whole thing, and why those issues have not gone away. That experience has not gone away. It has impacted who we are today, along with some of the social, economic, and political issues that have left us in poverty, without the resources, being under-resourced in all realms, educational, health, etc. So, thought it was a great presentation. Great applause at the end.
I was going to say, I'm thinking it sounds great, John.
Right. So a young gentleman stands up who was obviously a student and said, you people, you and your people are always looking for an excuse for basically why you are the way you are today. And it took me a few minutes to gather my thoughts around that. And so later I shared it with my elder, Uncle Jim. And he said to me, when there is understanding, there is no need for an explanation. And when there is no understanding, there is no explanation. So I think that helped me to reframe my approach. And my approach then began to say, I will share the information. And if you need numbers about our disparities, they're there. You can find them. And I'll provide you the knowledge that is there. But I'm not here to explain anymore why we are the way we are and who we are. If the intention was to know, then you would accept the knowledge. But if that's not your intention, then I'm not going to explain it. And that has really helped to shift my thinking in why we do what we do in some of the intervention work we do around health disparities, in the sense that if we spend all of our time explaining, it may go nowhere. It may not be accepted, like this young gentleman in that audience. He didn't accept it, but it has to take a different approach. And so I began to really focus on helping to return our youth to being interested in and encouraging them to look at who they were originally and who they were meant to be, and that we have the right to be who we were meant to be. We have the sovereign right. We have treaties. We have other Indigenous values and beliefs that can inform us in a different way and can help us to strive to have what we refer to as health equity versus just living to resolve and do away with disparities. If we were to do away with all of our health disparities, it still doesn't mean that we would be living with optimal health equity, which we were supposed to have. And I think that's often not known, but we were guaranteed that through the treaties. Our ancestors sacrificed land, lives, and many times culture so that the descendants, like myself and others, would have the optimal that was promised in the treaties. And so that's where the focus has taken us. We have strengths. Our ancestors survived that genocide experience, and we just have to call it what it is, what it was, and what it is, and what it still is. And it's a genocide experience. And every time we lose someone to suicide, every time we lose someone to overdose, every time we lose someone to some of the other diseases that could have been addressed, et cetera, because of either being under-resourced or some of the other issues, genocide continues. And if we lose our students to not being successful in obtaining the education that could be, it's another form of genocide. So that has sort of become the mandate. And this is international among Indigenous people. It's not just.
I was going to say, when I've been in other countries, I was in First Nations in Canada at one of the meetings, and I could just shift a few words out, and I think it's a very similar story. So this experience that you had where you give this presentation and a student comes up to you, asks a question that helps you to reflect on, I need to share the story and stop explaining. How do you approach this situation now so that you're not explaining yourself, but you're helping people to understand what the story is so that there is a better understanding of why the disparities exist the way they do?
There are between 6 and 7 million Native Americans in the U.S. in many places. And so it's hard to paint one stroke of that we're all the same. We're similar in the experience that we have been through this genocide experience, but sometimes it occurred differently for different areas and for different folks. So our health disparity numbers are that we have some of the highest rates of diabetes, cancer, definitely substance use, and now our suicide is increasing. And there are many reasons for that, when you have areas under-resourced, et cetera. But we have lived many pandemics, and we're still living pandemics. We definitely have this COVID virus pandemic, but we have lived the pandemic of discrimination. We lived the pandemic of systemic institutional racism. And so all of these have impacted our numbers. Like, for instance, Native American nurses in the U.S. with a doctorate degree, and I'm particularly referring to the PhD, is in the 20s, somewhere around maybe 23 to 25. Now, out of 6 to 7 million people, there's only 23 maybe Native American nurses with PhDs. So just horrible disparity. Yeah. And not that
and
the
representation
PhD,
matters, doesn't it?
Right. It does. Representation matters. And it also means it provides access to being able to do some of the things that we need to do to bring equity, to bring health equity. You've got to have the credentials. You've got to have the voice. Mm-hmm. And I know myself, having that credential and having done the scientific work to have an evidence-based intervention recognized by a federal agency, it gives me voice. Gives me representation.
It gives you credibility. It gives you influence.
Yes. Yeah. And so it's how our system works and the society works. So when we become invisible and we don't get acknowledged, the genocide continues. I'll give you an example. Recently, there was a poll where you had to identify yourself as either all the usual, and then there was none for Native or Indigenous, but there was a place for something else. If you were something else, other. But it actually said, this one poll said something else. So on one of the social networks, many of us who were Native said, well, I went to bed Indigenous, woke up being something else. And so, of course, no pun intended, many of us said, we know we're something else, but, hey, still, we don't get to identify who we really are. We stay invisible. I know in the early months of COVID-19, they were not classifying you were Native and collecting that data and identifying the Native data.
And if we do not collect the racial, ethnic, and cultural identities during the diagnosis and the treatment and death, we will never know, and we will never address the disparity. The research center that you've established, Center for Indigenous Nursing Research for Health Equity, do I have that right?
Correct.
And in order to get to health equity, we got to understand what the disparities are first.
Yep.
So in this moment in time where you've got this collection of really the preeminent experts, let's just talk about what you're finding, and then we'll go to how you're solving it, how you're innovating to solve it.
Where a lot of my work and my team's work is involved is with the youth, because they're living in situations maybe very remote, not going to school, not being able to have the support to deal with the stress, and they're living in stressful situations. Maybe mom and dad can't work. So for my work and my team's work, we are really concerned about the youth and what's happening with the youth, and because they are our future and we need to save them and we need to help them. And so if we don't address that in a timely way, we are starting to lose them, where it's bad enough where suicide becomes the option. We are in crisis, and that is happening. We are seeing that. There are ways to help to intervene in that and hopefully be able to connect. So there are challenges with that because many areas don't have Wi-Fi capabilities. And so that isolation becomes huge. And then the hopelessness sets in. And then when the only option becomes suicide, it's just devastating. And
so before the pandemic, the major area of your research and your focus and the innovation work around the talking circle, I'll just name it right now so that we can chat about it. You were already identifying that Native American youth were already suffering at a higher risk. The risk-taking behavior, alcohol consumption, was already starting at an earlier age than their white counterparts. Can you describe what that was before the pandemic?
Yes, I'll share a story called the Bear Story that we share with our students and the young that's in the Talking Circle project. So the Bear Story begins with, if a bear were to come in to our place, what would you want to do? Would you want to run from the bear or stay and fight the bear? And so what do we call that? We call that fight or flight. So
I'm definitely running, John.
Yes, which is the wrong thing to do, by the way. It's the wrong thing. Yeah, more noise and so forth. Yeah, so, but I'd probably be right there with you running. So then we talk about, so what's happening when the bear shows up? And we give them the information about Creator gave us in our bodies a community of members, just like our family and the communities we live in. Something was to show up that could harm us. Sometimes those community members come out to help us. So just like in our bodies, we have community members also, and we call them organs. One organ might send us a substance called cortisol, which is our stress hormone. Cortisol comes out, it helps us, gives us energy, etc. So does adrenaline, so does a lot of things. Another thing that might come out in full force is glucose, which is sugar. So once glucose is flowing through our bodies and it needs to be pushed by something that comes behind it, which is called insulin, enough cortisol that is secreted will block that insulin from helping to push this glucose to be utilized. So then all of a sudden now we have high levels of glucose, we have high levels of cortisol. Cortisol is also very damaging in many ways, cardiovascular wise, etc. And it takes 8 hours to absorb once cortisol has been secreted. So if the bear shows up every 2 hours, we're constantly in this high cortisol, which becomes very destructive to us. Just some examples of some of the things that happens when the bear shows up. Then we talk about what is the bear. Is the bear maybe mom and dad coming home in a bad way? Maybe it was the bully on the playground at school. Maybe it was the teacher giving you a hard time because of who you are, and where you're from. It could be because maybe you don't know where you're sleeping tonight. You might be having to sleep, on the floor at another family member's auntie, uncle's house because of the poverty, because of the situation, because of the substance use. Maybe it's because you didn't have a meal. You won't have a meal when you go home this evening. All of these things. And maybe we don't see the bear, but because of the memory of the trauma that we've inherited genetically, that could be triggered by an image out somewhere, or by an experience, somebody saying something. All of a sudden we go through this anxiety producing fight or flight response. We're programmed to be much more hyper vigilant. So because of all the trauma that we've inherited, that gives us then therefore a basis to begin to talk to whatever tribal group, whatever cultural base the youth are, to encourage them to begin to explore and find out what are some of the cultural truths and strengths in the culture that helps you to deal with all of these issues, the stress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all of these issues. Explore them. Let's talk about them. Let's talk about what we can do, because it's strength-based. My grandmother used to say, rambunctious today. Go to your secret place. We were taught internally, inside, and externally, out in nature, there were secret places. And then there were prayers we knew to do. There was the cedar tree to lean upon. If you felt just so out of sorts, you could go to the cedar tree, because the cedar tree has much to offer in the sense of coping and regaining strength and regaining our sense of being and who we were to be, and to be grounded again. Just one example. All of these things are so important. And again, it's not, what we do is not just, let's talk about what's wrong with using substances. What's happened for us as a people, we were taught or imposed to take the drink, to take the pills when the bear shows up. Why are you feeling so anxious? Here's some medication that's going to help with that. You got pain? Okay, here. So just take these and that'll be fine. That was our history. It was the imposition. It was the imposed way of coping that was not cultural based and not strength based. And so this took so much root over time and was so destructive for our communities. So this is one of the approaches that we have used with our youth, is to begin to look at where the strengths are again in the culture. As far back as we can remember, what were some of those heroes and heroines in the culture, and why do you think they were able to survive through many atrocities again? And we have seen youth just make a 180, just really, make a turn when they got in touch and connected to who they are, who they were meant to be, and began to really connect to it. The changes happen. So it's been very rewarding to see.
So when I read about your work with the Talking Circle, and I really do think about this as an innovation that is rooted in ancient wisdom, how are you sharing it with people and persuading people that you've had incredibly positive results in short periods of time, helping adolescents to choose to move away from substance use? Can you describe a talking circle?
So a talking circle is a way of coming together in a respectful manner. No one is greater than or less than, no matter what your experience is, who you are, and then coming together and being able to share life's experience in a very safe and respectful manner, and everyone has the opportunity to share and give input. And so that's one of the ways we start, and that's part of that whole Native Reliance theoretical model is of respect. It's part of being responsible. And in the introduction session at the beginning, we talk about what it means to be respectful, and that everyone's story, you're going to hear lots of different stories and their lived experience in this talking circle. And every story is to be respected and kept confidential and kept in that circle. And so the ideal of the circle becoming sacred, it just takes a whole different tone, a whole different energy than you would see in a classroom. What happens is it becomes a very different approach and setting than they've usually experienced. Most schools usually give drug and alcohol education through a program that talks about all the do's and don'ts around and why it's so bad. And actually we have had comments from, because we usually do a control, which is they get that usual standard type of education. And we have seen and actually learned that sometimes what the youth are hearing is, oh, well, if I smoke a little pot, then maybe it will make me feel better than what I usually do. So once they began to experience that this is much different than just learning about drugs and alcohol, and then many will ask, when can we do this again?
Why is it important that everyone's story is shared and heard?
As we often share with the youth, and this emanates from the Native Reliance theoretical model, that without everyone's contribution and being a part of the group, then therefore the group is not whole. Most Native and Indigenous cultures are not individualistic or more collective, but everyone contributes to that collectiveness. And so I think this is just one of those ways we demonstrate and have the youth connect to that.
It seems like you have really embraced technology and moved these into online platforms. They're on a Zoom call and they're putting together the talking circles. How's that working?
It's very interesting because I think the youth are probably much more adaptable to it and more amenable to it than probably we are as older adults, but it didn't take long. We recently had one project where we had 3 different tribes connect across the country. And it was really interesting to see how they were interested in the other group, in another tribal group from a different area in the country, and how they connected and began conversing and dialoguing. It was just really fascinating. One of my dreams is to be able to do this transnational, so that maybe we'll have our youth here connect virtually with Aboriginal youth in Australia or New Zealand, and I think it would be just fascinating for the stories to be shared and to see the similarities and differences, but what that would mean to the youth. I think we are in a time when we need to have this next generation be able to understand and come to know that they are part of a bigger group across the world, and that unity, that interaction, that intersection of who we are as Indigenous people is going to be very, very important as we move and journey throughout time. Having the opportunity to do that is going to be very important.
How did you develop your interest in adolescence and specifically substance use, alcohol, smoking, lifestyle that really address their overall mental health? Where did that come from?
I think that came from when I was young. We had a cousin who returned from the Vietnam War and seemed to be lost when he returned. He succumbed to complications of alcohol abuse because he turned to alcohol to cope when he returned, and he was only 32. And I recall my grandmother being so grieved, and she said, "It got another one of us." And I remember thinking about, what is the it? And if I could do something about the it, and I was only about 10 years old, if I could do something about the it, then maybe it would relieve that grief and that suffering. It became a part of who I am, to see my father being very resilient, never having gone to school, served in the military, served in World War II, and went through all of that experience and had many challenges and barriers, but still was resilient. And I think as I grew and experienced others in our family and extended family have those challenges and succumb to some of the challenges, like the substance abuse and the complications from substance abuse, really helped for me to ask the questions, why some and not others? And of course, as I grew older and then became more involved in my career and really began to realize and put it together that the culture was a protective factor, and that steeped in the culture was many strengths and not negatives. Even though we were told that our culture was really not a strength, but it was a negative. But I grew to understand and to know in a deeper way that the culture was the strength and still is. And so that has informed my work, and especially in the intervention work that we do, that it's the culture and the strength of the culture that we try to provide back to our youth and have them connect to it in a greater way, in a deeper way, so that their lives are much richer and more resilient. And they are who we were meant to be and created to be. And interesting how that followed me to this point in life, to have done the work around developing the talking circle intervention in the area of preventing and early intervention of substance use.
So let's talk about innovation. What's the Indigenous way of thinking about innovation?
I look at my ancestors as being very innovative in having developed what they developed over time, and even formal education approaches and settings. I think historically, for many Native people, and especially my tribe, saw where male and females could be equally educated, when for the most part in the U.S. at that time, they were not being seen as equal. And so we believe in balance, so in equality. So I think that was very innovative. So I think we've always had this innovation ability. And so maybe I've inherited some of that. Yeah, so I think we can still be discovering what that innovation is. And I think we need a collective versus just a few of us. We need a larger collective. And that's one of the places where I'm going to focus on, is really growing that group of Native and Indigenous nurses to be able to do this kind of work.
Indigenous nurse researcher John Lowe is a professor at the University of Texas at Austin School of Nursing, where he holds the Joseph Blades Centennial Memorial Professorship Chair. John is a Cherokee Native American tribal member, and he established the first Center for Indigenous Nurse Research for Health Equity. And it is there he works on innovations such as the talking circle and furthers the work and understanding of health equity and optimal health that Indigenous nurses are uniquely prepared and positioned to advance. As Indigenous communities around the globe continue to face unequaled challenges, John's insights on resilience, racialized mental health, trauma, and healing bring a much-needed, strength-based approach to conversation. He has also developed and tested the virtual talking circle, where through the use of video conferencing technology, the talking circle practice is being delivered to multiple Indigenous youth throughout the United States. Ancestral stories and legacies provide strength and a way to understand ourselves in the context of a greater history and current circumstances. In some ways, the stories about our ancestors, our communities, our families serve as a superpower. And when we don't know those stories, or they've been erased, we can't harness their life-saving potential. Talking about the past can build resilience. As John's work demonstrates, resilience isn't a fixed personality trait. We're not born with a set amount of it. Resilience is a muscle we can build, and we can do it collectively. Listening to the stories of others is a sacred act. As John said, all stories need to be included and respected. And when they are, it takes on a whole different tone, a whole different energy. The talking circle fosters a deeper sense of belonging that allows for healing, for cleansing, connection, and gratitude. Sharing stories and history with others helps tap into cultural strengths and reveals that we possess within ourselves what is needed to adapt during difficult times, to not only recover, but to overcome and thrive. For See You Now, I'm Shauna Butler. Thanks for listening.
Nurses are transforming healthcare through innovation, compassion, and leadership. And Johnson & Johnson is proud to continue its 125-year commitment to champion nurses through recognition, skill building, leadership development, and more. The American Nurses Association is dedicated to building a culture of innovation. Nurses improve the lives of patients and communities through innovative thinking, empathetic connection, scientific rigor, and sheer determination. ANA is proud to support and advocate for our nation's most valuable healthcare resource, our nurses. For more information on See You Now and to listen to any of the earlier episodes in our library, visit seeyounowpodcast.com.